Along Japan's rugged northern coast, where the sea meets steep cliffs and kelp forests sway beneath the waves, a small but determined population of sea otters has begun to reclaim its home. Once wiped out by the fur trade of the 1800s, these charismatic marine mammals have returned to the shore of Hokkaido, a fragile comeback that tells a story of resilience, science, and hope. Welcome back to the Impact Storytelling Podcast. I'm your host, Sabine Probst Saavedra, Ocean Conservation Storyteller and Organization Director, and today I'm joined by Samantha Hamilton, a marine biologist whose work dives deep into this remarkable recovery. Samantha is a PhD researcher studying sea otter foraging behavior, prey preferences, and ecological impact at Cape Kiritappu, one of the few places in Japan where sea otters have re-established permanent population. Her research marks one of the first efforts to understand how these endangered animals are shaping Hokkaido's coastal ecosystems as they return. Beyond her doctoral work, Samantha is also part of the team of Sea Otter Savvy, a California-based conservation and outreach program dedicated to protecting southern sea otters and promoting responsible wildlife viewing. For her work, both sides of the Pacific, she explores how science, community, and storytelling can come together to support the conservation of one of the ocean's most beloved species. In this episode, we'll uncover the story of Japan's rebounding sea otters, how they hunt, how they heal their habitats, and how researchers like Samantha are working to ensure their survival in a changing world. Because saving sea otters isn't just about science, it's about rebuilding connections between species, coasts, and cultures. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, Samantha. It's so nice to have you on the podcast today. I'm very excited about our conversation. Do you remember your first encounter with a sea otter, either in the wild or through a story? And how did that moment shape your passion for marine life?
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I love this question because it kind of takes me back to the first days of my sea otter research. And I remember this moment very clearly when I first saw my wild sea otter. Um, it happened in 2022. I was working as an intern at Monterey, and um, a very kind research biologist took me out into the field with her at a local beach, and we had all our equipment, including our high-powered telescopes, and she tells me the first thing she says is, "Look out, look for otters, and then put your telescope on them, and then look at them a little bit closer." And I start panicking because 'cause I'm like, "I don't see any sea otters out there. I don't know what you're talking about." All I saw was ocean and kelp, and I was like, "Oh no, what do I do?" And so I just started playing around with the telescope, and eventually I hit upon my first wild sea otter. And it was such a magical moment because without that instrument, there's nothing for me to look at. There's nothing for me to see. But with the telescope, I was finally able to see one, and it's a moment where you can't believe that they're actually out there, because you can't see them with your naked eye. And so it was such an inspiring moment, and, um, I had so much fun looking through that telescope. I mean, I could look at otters all day through that instrument. It's it's amazing all the details and quality you can see. That was the first time I ever saw my wild sea otter, and ever since then, I've been looking at them all the time, so it never gets old.
It's lovely. I can see how happy you are just talking about it. It must have been a really, really lovely moment.
Oh, it's wonderful, and anytime you let someone who's never looked at sea otters that close use the telescope for the first time, they have the same exact
Yeah.
reaction. They're astounded. Yeah.
Wonderful. And you've written also very beautifully about your Sundays at Elkhorn Slough. I hope I didn't say that wrong. Describing the otters, they're almost like old friends. What draws you most to observing them so closely and consistently?
I would say that, of course, they're cute, but they're so much fun to look at because they have individuality. Um, they have big and different personalities, and I think that's what makes observing them so much fun. Um, you never know what you're gonna get. Sometimes you get a lazy otter who just wants to sleep all day. Sometimes you get a very busy otter who likes foraging all the time, and even their dives are different. Some of them dive a little bit bigger and splash more, others are much quieter, and so they each have their own distinct personality, and I think that's what keeps me coming back to observing them over and over.
Are you looking at individuals of one group, or at the whole group in general?
Oh, it's so hard to tell. When you just look at them, they look pretty identical, and so, um it's really hard to distinguish, so I don't know if I'm looking at the same one every single time or if I'm looking at different ones, I have no clue. The only way to tell is if they're tagged, and sometimes on their flippers, different institutions are able to put, like, really colorful tags on them, and that's the only, like, definitive way to tell that, "Oh, this is, I don't know, Ruby, and this is someone else," and, but I don't get the good fortune of having tagged otters, so they all look identical to me.
So there is like also their fur and their colors are all the same?
Um, actually, no. So, generally what happens is the older they get, they become more grizzled, and grizzled basically means blonde. And so, the older otters, they tend to be more blonde or white. And so in that way, sometimes you can distinguish them. Also, they have different nose scars, and so they can have different patterns, and you can kind of tell them apart from that too. But especially the younger ones, they all look pretty much the same. They have very dark brown fur, and some of them don't have any nose scars, and so they can be really tricky to tell apart.
I guess for the nose scar, you also need to see it really closely that you can see if there are any scars.
Yes, yeah, and sometimes they change over time too because they
Uh,
start
yeah.
healing or they get a new scar, and so that's not always the best indicator, so
Okay. And before we dive into your research, can you share what inspired you to pursue a path in marine biology and specifically to focus on sea otters?
yeah, so this is another very memorable moment for me. So I first got into sea otters because of the Seattle Aquarium, actually. I visited that aquarium in 2019, and back then they had, I want to say, 4 or 5 sea otters on exhibit. Today they've got 2, but back in those days they had about double that number. And there was a very nice guide there who was telling us all about their natural history, a bit about each of their personalities, what they like to eat, how they get along with each other. And included in that information was a story about their history and how there's still to this day a 1,000-mile gap in their range due to the historic fur trade. And ever since then, I said, "Well, I wanna help correct that, I wanna help close that gap." And so ever since then, I've just been enjoying sea otter research, getting into it, and doing my best to support their conservation.
Amazing. And Sea Otter Savvy has been your scientific home base. How did you first get involved with this organization, and what have you learned from working with them and their team?
So ever since that inspirational moment at the Seattle Aquarium, I took to the internet to try to find out how I can get involved, and that's when I found Sea Otter Savvy. They're a nonprofit based out of Central California, and they do great work doing public outreach and research having to do with sea otter and human interactions. And so I thought, "This sounds really cool and fun, but mostly important." And so I wanted to dive in, and I reached out to them, and I started off as a volunteer, and I eventually became an intern, supporting their research and their outreach work. And they're an amazing organization to work with. I get to do all sorts of things. I get to interact with scientists, collect data, and at the same time, I also get to engage with the public and teach them about sea otters. So, it's a ton of fun being their intern, and I feel like it's extremely rewarding, and it's always so fun to be able to turn the research I do into really important talking points that I get to share with everyone else.
How do you educate the people when they come to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a few ways that Sea Otter Savvy engages with the public. One of the most common ones is through classroom visits. So staff and volunteers will go visit different schools, elementary schools, middle schools, and bring sea otters to them. And so we'll show them a sea otter pelt. We'll show them photos of sea otters. We'll bring in sea otter prey items. And from all those things, they get to learn about sea otters and how they live, and how we should be interacting with them. And other ways is we also bring students out into the field through field trips. And so they can come out to various sea otter habitat and learn firsthand what sea otters are doing in the wild. That's always a ton of fun for students. And we usually reach broader audiences like adults through like public booths. And so whenever there's like a big event, like every year they have one in March. I don't remember the name of it now, but every year they have these huge events, and Sea Otter Savvy likes to hold booths there and talk to the public about sea otters that way too.
You mentioned earlier you're also working with scientists, and you had this great opportunity to join Dr. Yoko Mitani's lab in Japan. How did that connection come about, and what was your reaction when you learned you'd be traveling halfway around the world to study otters?
Yeah, so this is another really key pivotal moment I feel like in my sea otter research journey. And so back in 2021, I attended a conference in Seattle, and the conference is any sea otter lover's dream. You get a whole bunch of sea otter scientists there talking about their work. And it's held every other year, so I look forward to it every time. And in that year, there were a couple of sea otter scientists from Japan that participated. And through talking with them during and after the conference, I was able to connect with Dr. Matani, who is leading the marine mammal group over at Kyoto University. And she conducts a lot of field work on sea otters in Japan. And so uh, her lab basically welcomed me and invited me to partake in one of their sea otter censuses in 2023. And I said, of course, of course I want to partake and join in that. And so, through multiple forms of transportation, through plane rides, train rides, bus rides, I even think a taxi here or there, I finally got to the study site and I was able to pitch in and help out with their multiple projects.
Amazing. That sounds like a long trip to get there. And what were your first impressions when you finally arrived at the island?
My first impressions, I think just how quiet and serene it was. I think I was expecting more of a, a hustle and bustle because it's a pretty commercially busy area, but it was surprisingly quiet. And that probably had to do with how early we would start our days
How early would you start?
doing sea otter work. Oh man, it was probably like 6 or 7 in the morning.
Okay.
We try to get there as soon as the sun rose, and then we would work for hours after that. And so that probably contributed to my first impression, but it was just and it also struck me how similar it was to where I usually work in
Uh-huh.
California. And so I think it goes to show that wherever sea otters live, the places might look pretty similar.
Do you like their habitat?
They do. They love being near the shore. They love all the kelp, and so I
Yeah.
think those are some commonalities that we'll see no matter where you are in their
Yeah.
range.
And Japan's sea otter population is still very small and recovering after being wiped out in the 1800s. What was it like to see these few individuals thriving where none existed for over a century?
Oh, it was so inspiring. Um, I feel like in California, you kind of take the sea otter population there for granted sometimes because today there's about 3,000 of them in that state. But in Japan, you've only got a handful. And so when you see them at this very early stage of recovery, it's it's almost like magic. You can't believe that they're there after not being there for so long, and you're rooting for them. You're rooting for their success. They were able to make it down to Japan naturally from Russia, and so you really want them to succeed. You want their population to grow. You want the range to expand, and it's it's such a heartwarming feeling to be able to see them recover on their own and kind of retake parts of the range that they were extirpated from.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about sea otters in general?
Yeah, sea otters in general. Okay, well, I think for most people, they are just a cute face. They are really fluffy. They have these really big eyes and nose, and you just gravitate to them because of how they look. But I think as a researcher, they're much more than that. Um, they're ecosystem superheroes, so they do a lot to maintain the health of the habitats that they live in. Um, and part of that is also combating climate change. So through their ability to predate on different invertebrates, they're able to keep kelp and seagrass thriving, and that increases the amount of carbon that's stored. And so in that way, they're helping to offset climate change, which is really cool. And it's and they're pretty when you see them in the water, they look pretty small. And so people are like, "That's an apex predator? I can't believe that." Because when you think of an apex predator, you're thinking of, like, sharks and these much bigger and almost more, I don't know, much less cute animals. And so I'm like, "No, yeah, sea otters are a very important apex keystone predator, and they have such a vital role in the ecosystems that they live in." And I don't think we knew that until they were taken out of those systems and put back in some places. And so their conservation is extremely important, not only because they're an important species, but also because of the ecosystems that they live in.
Yeah. When I was researching the questions for this podcast episode, I stumbled across a lot of pictures of sea otters holding hands.
Oh, what's up with that? That is so funny because I feel like that is the number one fact that everyone points to when they think of sea otters. But they don't hold hands as commonly as you would think. That's, like, an extremely rare interaction, and it usually happens almost only in zoos and aquariums. I've never seen that in wild sea otters, so, it happens, but definitely not as often as you would think.
Okay. And do they know why? Or
I don't know, I think the common thing is they do it so they don't drift apart, but if you're in an aquarium, there's not much drifting going on, and so I'm not sure. I think they sometimes they enjoy each other's company, and they just wanna kind of hang on to each other, and that's how they socialize, and that's my guess.
Can you walk us through a typical field day in Japan? What did data collection look like from dawn to dusk?
Yeah, so the most important thing is getting a good meal in. That is the first important key to a good field day. So you gotta eat a solid breakfast, and then from there, you hop into a car, you drive yourself over to the ocean, you climb onto a boat with all your gear on there, and then you take off for the island. And once you're there, you can do a variety of things. Usually, um, we don't have like a set plan of what we need to do first, second, third. We usually kind of let the weather and the sea otters dictate what we're doing that day. And so if the weather is poor, like if there's an excess amount of rain or wind or even fog is a really big challenge. Then sometimes we'll have to kind of wait it out, or we'll just cancel the field day and hope for a better day tomorrow. But if the weather is A-okay, then what'll happen is we let the sea otters dictate basically how we're collecting data for that day. And so if one of the first few sea otters we see are eating, we'll go ahead and collect foraging data right away. We don't miss an opportunity if we can. Um, but if they're more on the quiet side and they're resting, then we might be more inclined to do focal follows where we just kind of record what they're up to every single minute for a set amount of time. Um, and if at other times we want to collect a census, those are if we want to break from doing all the focal follows and the foraging data collection, then we'll go ahead and take the boat around the islands and count how many there are. So really, it's generally the weather and the otters that decide what we're up to.
Yeah, I think often with nature, you just have to see what's going on with weather and the animals and if they appear or not, or if it's raining or
Right?
not.
Yeah.
Mm.
Right. Yeah, you can't ever tell what they're gonna be up to that day,
Yeah.
so you just kinda gotta go in and roll with the punches.
And how does the focal follows technique help researchers understand the ecology and energy use?
Yeah, so focal falls are a lot of fun. You're basically following a s a specific target sea otter for about it depends on the technique, but it could be 15 to 30 minutes, and you basically record what they're up to every single minute. And by doing that, you get a good snapshot of what they tend to be doing in their habitat. And then from those, you can kind of extract their activity budgets, which is basically how much time do they spend doing a particular activity each day. And that's extremely important because that kind of gives us an idea of how they balance out their energy during the day. So, sea otters are really unique animals. They don't have blubber, and so energy is extremely crucial for them. And so they're able to kind of control how much energy they have through eating, which lets them gain energy, and resting, which lets them kind of save their energy. And so if scientists are able to kind of figure out, well, what portion of their day are they spending gaining energy and what portion of their day are they spending conserving energy, then we kind of get a better idea of how they're doing in their energetics.
Mhm. And is it different for each individual?
Um, I would say that's really hard to know without individualized tags on them, and that would be extremely interesting to find out. But on the whole, we just kind of average their behavior and say that sea otters in this population, they devote X percent of time to resting and X percent of time foraging. So,
And you have also observed a mom pup pair that left a strong impression on you. What did their interactions reveal about sea otter parenting and social behavior?
oh, this is a great question. So, I love observing mom and pup pairs. They're so fun to watch and see how they interact with each other and what they do when they're standalone. And it's it's so tough being a sea otter mom. I think that's the biggest takeaway that I get when I observe them. Because they're doing the job of parenting all by themselves. There's no sea otter dad that comes in and helps them out. And so the sea otter mom, she has so much that she has to do every day, not only just to survive for herself, but also to maintain the health of her pup. And so their activity budgets are wild. They probably have to forage a majority of their day in order to constantly get energy to fuel themselves and their baby. And so a lot of times when the sea otter pup is really young and the mom has to go out foraging, you'll see them just kind of floating on the surface by themselves for a good chunk of time. And sometimes they'll kind of cry out, but they're basically like a cork and they're just floating up there and there's nothing for them to do. They're just kind of chilling. While their mom is really busy getting their sustenance. So I think that's my biggest takeaway is it's so hard to be a sea otter mom. And so it makes it all the more important for humans whenever we're in their habitat to give them space and watch them respectfully and not interrupt their daily activities so that the mom and her pup are able to survive.
Yeah. How long can sea otters stay underwater?
Oh, I get this question a lot actually. I think the record for longest dive is about 5 minutes. And so, it's funny because some sea otters, they have radios, and so we can track them with radio telemetry. And 5 minutes feels like forever, I think, to a sea otter biologist. When they're underwater and you can kind of hear the signal when they're on the surface of the water versus when they're diving. The signals sound different. And so you know when they're underwater and you're waiting, waiting, waiting for them to surface so that you can see what they're eating or what their next behavior is gonna be. And those 5 minutes feel like a lifetime, but in reality, it's not that long, I guess. But it's still pretty impressive that they're able to. Yeah, I think it was an adult male who was able to hold his breath there for 5 minutes.
So, how long do mom and pup usually stay together? Is it a couple weeks or months or a whole lifetime? And why is the pup father not in the picture?
So, mom and pup pairs, tend to stick together for about 6 months, and then at that point, the pup will hopefully, gain its independence and be able to go about its way and survive on its own. Um, Sea otter fathers, they're just not in the picture. They're just there to mate, and then they just kinda leave the female to be, and then she's solely responsible for raising her pup. Um, and so it just makes it all the more harder for the sea otter mom to be able to live and care for her pup. It's so hard. I feel so bad for them every time I see them out in the water. It looks like such a struggle to be able to take care of uh this usually screaming little pup. It's and wrangle them because especially when they're juveniles, they're very active and they like bothering other sea otters, and so the sea otter mom has to kind of rein them in too, and so she's got a lot on her hands. And oftentimes there's something called lactation syndrome, which is basically when the mom just can't keep up with the energetic demand to be able to take care of herself and the pup, and it can be fatal. And so, um, yeah, it's definitely not easy raising a pup as a sea otter mom.
Is it usually at least just one pup?
Yes, so usually one pup. Twins are very, very rare, and in those instances, because it's such a difficult time taking care of a pup, they usually have to let go of one in order to be able to take care of the other one really well.
And if you're at a location with multiple sea otters, so they just came from different places all together and decided they want to live together?
That is a great question. And so there's someone doing research on their social dynamics because there's so little we understand about it. Um, it's really interesting because at certain times of the year, they like to raft up together in huge numbers, like in the hundreds. And so you just see this huge sea of sea otters. It's wild. But there's some speculation as to why they raft and why they raft in larger numbers at certain times of the year. It could be because of the weather. If the weather's poor and the waves are harsher, then they'll kind of want to group together for protection. Um, but I don't think we know why they tend to want to raft with others, um, and why during certain times of the year too.
Mhm.
I think that's still a mystery.
More to research.
Yes, always.
And in addition to behavioral observations, your team also collected benthic samples to study prey communities. What were some of the most interesting or surprising prey species you identified?
The one that always surprises me, so some of the most common types of prey are crabs, urchins, clams. I think those 3 are pretty standard throughout the range. But it's always surprising to me that sea otters tend to eat snails, and snails that can be really small sometimes too. Um, Especially for a creature that needs a lot of energy and you're looking at this tiny snail, you would think, "Why are you picking this over other items?" And so that's the one that always makes me chuckle a little. It's funny when you see them eat snails, they'll usually try to get a whole bunch at one time, and then they'll go through them very quickly. They'll eat them really, really fast. So it kind of looks like popcorn when they're eating it because they just go through it so quickly. But it always amazes me that when sea otters decide to select a very small prey item.
Yeah, like a snack. And for
Yes.
the crustaceans, how do they open it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there's multiple methods that they can open these invertebrates. One is just by cracking them against their sternum. Um, that's probably the most common thing I see out in the field is they'll just crack them against their body and then they're able to open it. They'll definitely bite into it and try to pry into things with their sharp teeth. They also use tools, which is really interesting. They usually take a rock and they'll smash the prey against the rock until it opens. And sometimes it's not a rock. I've seen them pick up bricks and smash them against that. I've seen them smash things against boats to try to crack open things. Yeah, they're very intelligent and creative creatures.
Sounds like it. Part of your work involved estimating population size through boat-based censuses. What did you find and what trends are emerging for Japan's growing otter population?
Yeah, so back in 2023, when I participated in the Sea Otter census in Japan, I think in the specific area that we were looking at, there was about 15 to 16 sea otters there at the time. Um, and today that number fluctuates, and that's probably because they're moving around different pockets of the coast. And so numbers change from place to place. At the particular study site that I'm interested in, called Cape Kiritappu, they have about the same number there too, around 15 or so otters. And that number changes throughout the year because sea otters move and drift or they'll come back. And so that number can grow up to 20. Sometimes it can be two. It just depends on the time of the year and how the population's doing.
And Cape Kiritappu was your second field site, right? A place shrouded in fog and mystery in your writing. Can you tell us about that moment when you spotted the lone sea otter there?
Yes. So that place is so cool and magnificent. You're high up on a cliff, but the problem with that is the fog can roll in and totally shroud what you're seeing. And so that's exactly what happened on that day, and it was tough to even see the water out of the ocean, it was that foggy. And we were there for minutes and minutes trying to find a sea otter, and finally, after what felt like forever, we were finally able to spot one. And it was just resting up against a cliff at Cape Kiritappu, and it was so amazing because I thought I was gonna leave that study site without seeing a sea otter, which would have been really sad for me. But I'm very fortunate to have been able to spot that one in the fog, and I think it also goes to show that even though you can't see them, 'em, they're definitely out there. Just like on my first day out in the field when I couldn't spot wild otters with just my eyes, even with all the tools, when you have fog, you still can't see them, but they're definitely out there, and they're thriving, and they're foraging, they're resting, they're doing everything despite not being able to see them.
Well, that's nice to know at least, even if you can't see them. And how do these small populations from Japan um, are in comparison to the ones in places like California or Alaska?
Yeah, so the numbers in Japan's population are extremely small compared to other parts of their range. And so in California, they've got about 3,000 sea otters currently. Um, and in Alaska is probably where they have the most. They have hundreds of thousands of sea otters up there. Um, and so it's interesting because in different parts of their historical range, they're recovering at different rates and in different numbers. And so we see a bunch of different little experiments playing out for researchers to be able to collect data from and better understand how conservation strategies might be working in some places and maybe not in others. So it's a real life experiment, unfortunately, that's occurring because of the historical fur trade. But Japan's population by far is currently the smallest.
but hopefully it's getting bigger. And sea otters are often described as a keystone species. For all listeners who might not be familiar with that or know what that means, could you explain what it means and why otters are so crucial for the coastal ecosystems? You already said a little bit before, but is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, so any keystone species basically means that they're vital to how that ecosystem is structured. And without them, the ecosystem basically collapses and it'll look very different. And so, in terms of sea otters, they're considered a keystone because of their huge appetite. And so, they're able to eat a whole variety of invertebrates, including urchins. And when they do that, they make those populations small. And in turn, because invertebrates like to eat, many of them are herbivorous, and so they like to eat kelp or seagrass. So if the invertebrate population is small, that in turn allows kelp forests to grow and thrive. And it's through this cascade, kind of these indirect effects that sea otters have, that they're considered a keystone species. And so that's why whenever you remove them from a particular system, that system, the health of it tends to degrade over time, and then eventually you'll get invertebrate populations running them over to the detriment of kelp forests and seagrass beds. Um, and so that's why in a lot of areas, like in Oregon, where there's currently no sea otters, you have what are called urchin barrens, which are just all these sea urchins, no kelp forests, and they totally lack biodiversity. And so without sea otters, our coastlines look very different. And with them, they also look different. They look better. And so that's why conserving them is extremely important, not just for the species itself, but also for the areas that they live in.
Yeah, I heard of that sea urchin problem where they're nibbling away on the kelp and yeah, the kelp then is dying. Japan's coastal ecosystem differs from California's. What ecological questions are you hoping to answer through your PhD work at Cape Kiritappu about otter feeding and foraging success?
Yeah, so I'm really interested to find out what sea otters in Cape Kiritappu are eating, because that kind of clues us into how they're interacting with regional fisheries in the area. Um, Historically and currently, in a lot of places in the range, sea otters are interacting poorly with humans, especially fisheries, because they're competing for the same limited marine resources. And so at this very early stage in sea otter recovery in Japan, I'm interested to know how sea otters might already be interacting with those fisheries to help mitigate any future conflict if possible. Um, that's the goal of my current research, and I'm hoping that whatever results come from it will kind of inform our conservation strategies going forward and help pave the way for human and sea otters to coexist really well in the area.
Yeah. But do they eat a lot of fish as well?
That is a great question. So, in some areas, they eat fish. Like in Alaska, they are known to eat fish. In places like California, it's extremely, extremely rare. I've never seen them eat fish out in California. And in Japan, I think the jury's still out on that. I think there's just not enough data collected to know if they do or don't eat fish. From the data I've collected so far, they don't eat fish. They only eat invertebrates. So I think that's another informative piece to the greater puzzle of trying to carve out a path for human sea otter coexistence is just knowing basic things like that. Like, do they eat fish? Do they only eat invertebrates? What sort of invertebrates do they eat? Those are all important and outstanding questions that still need
Yeah.
to be answered.
Because then it doesn't sound so much like a competition to the fisheries. I mean, I don't know how much they eat of the crustacean or invertebrates in Japan, but it doesn't sound too much of a competition to me.
Right? Yeah, I think it's predominantly probably invertebrates, probably your crabs, your clams, and your urchins. I think that's where we'll probably see the most competition. But it's important to be able to collect the data to really pinpoint where that competition is and quantify it.
Back in California, Sea Otter Savvy focuses on reducing human disturbance to sea otters. What makes this issue so critical for their survival?
So sea otters are extremely unique. Unlike other marine mammals, they don't have a blubber layer, and blubber is what lets you hang on to energy for an extended period of time. And because sea otters don't have that, they're extremely vulnerable to disturbances. Um, because disturbances might interfere with their ability to gain more energy through behaviors like foraging or resting. And it can also possibly lead them to exert unnecessary energy that they could have conserved to escape from humans if they're being disturbed. And so that's why it's extremely critical for any coastal communities that live near sea otter habitat to be mindful of that and to give sea otters space whenever they see them because every day they might not seem like it, but it's very hard to be a sea otter and every day they have to do so much in order to gain and conserve energy. And if we interfere in that, we might be um, risking their survival or reproductive success. And so it's extremely important that whenever we're in their home, that we give them the space that they need.
Mm. And what do you see as their biggest threat?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say no matter the specifics, their biggest threat are humans. Um, Unfortunately, whether that be through, these, uh, direct instances of disturbance where, whether accidental or intentional, we're disrupting their behavior over time. If that happens repeatedly, that can definitely damage their survival. And I think on a larger scale too, things like oil spills, that's something that's of big concern, and that's definitely anthropogenic in nature. Um, that's definitely concerning, and sea otters are very vulnerable in that regard too, because they have this luxurious fur that needs to be well maintained in order for them to be warm out there in the cold ocean. And if you put oil on it, then uh, that fur can't be a good insulator anymore. And so oil is definitely a big concern, but I think any way you cut it, humans are probably the biggest threat to sea otters, unfortunately. But I think that also means that we can turn that around, and there's room for us to act positively and support their conservation if we're aware that we could be damaging their survival in the long run if we have oil spills, if we continue to disrupt their behaviors. So there's definitely room for change.
Did I remember that right that sea otters have the most dense fur of all animals?
Yes, that is very true. They are the furriest animals uh, on the whole planet, and they need all that fur in order to keep themselves warm out there in the cold ocean. I think people are always surprised. They think California, oh, the ocean must be warm. No, not where sea otters live. Um, and so they definitely need that fur. It's kind of like their wetsuit to be able to keep them warm out there. Yeah, and so any damage to that, including oil, would just be so detrimental to their survival.
Do they have any other predators?
So that is also a very interesting question. So they don't have there's not very many animals that consume them. The one I can think of that's a growing threat are orcas. And so I think this is more of like a recent phenomenon. It's definitely ticking up orca predation on sea otters. And that might have to do with the original orca prey, seals, declining in numbers, and maybe that's why orcas are looking to other sources of food like sea otters because, I mean, sea otters are just a ball of fur, really, and so, ah, you don't really want to go and get a sea otter if you can get a seal, because seals have so much blubber and they can give you so much more energy, and so, I think orcas and kind of, switching their prey up because of the reduction in their original prey. They're going after sea otters more recently, especially in Alaska. And so certain sea otter populations up there are kind of declining in number, probably because of this increased orca predation. And out in California, one of the highest sources of mortality for sea otters is shark bites. Um, but interestingly, the sharks don't actually consume the sea otters.
Too furry.
So what happens yes, too way too furry. They're like a fur ball. And so what happens is, especially juvenile sharks, they really can't tell the difference between seals and sea otters, and so they'll just kind of bite at anything thinking it's a seal. And when they come to find out that it's actually a sea otter, they'll just spit it right back out and they don't eat it. And so that accident actually is often fatal for sea otters. And yeah, unfortunately, that's one of the leading causes of mortality of sea otters in the California
Mm.
population.
I don't remember if I translated that right, but is it possible that sea otters are trying to steal surfboards?
Oh, yes, that's been all over the
Yeah.
news lately. Yeah, and so there's a sea otter that, yes, is attempting to steal surfboards, around Santa Cruz in California. It's unclear why the otter is doing this, but it seems like they really enjoy surfboards and, I think it's a really interesting case of how humans and sea otters are interacting, and on the whole, surfers are very good about giving space to sea otters. They interact with them extremely well, and sometimes they overlap in their habitat, but they each kinda keep to themselves. Sea otters tend to keep to themselves, surfers tend to keep to themselves and don't try to intentionally interact with each other. And so in this case, when the sea otter's trying to climb onto the surfboard, I think it's kinda testing, um, how they traditionally interact with each other, and I think it's really interesting to see. But I think for the most part, surfers, they understand that they're in the sea otter's home, and so they want to do their best to kinda keep their distance, and they're just concerned about really catching a good wave. They don't wanna be out there, to disturb sea otters, and so yes, but there is currently a sea otter trying to hop on boards.
What do you think it wants to do with the board?
That is great, and I think that's the question that every sea otter biologist has is, what does the sea otter want from this surfboard? There's some leading thoughts on this, so, 841, the sea otter that was climbing on surfboards a couple years ago, we thought that she might have been doing that because, it seemed to time with her pregnancies, and so we thought, "Oh, maybe her hormones are kinda driving her to want to climb on surfboards." Maybe she likes the texture of the surfboards. I don't know, so many questions, and so, we're not sure if this current otter that's jumping on surfboards is the same one that was climbing on surfboards a couple years back, but, I don't know, there's a lot of mystery there. Don't know why he or she likes the boards, but it could be, possibly, if it's the same one, it could be related to pregnancy-related hormones, or maybe she just likes the texture of the surfboard, or so many other reasons.
That's funny, because if she didn't try touching it before, then she wouldn't even know what texture it is, but it must have been the thought first that she wants to try it. Yeah,
Right? And the funny thing is sea otters are extremely curious animals, and they're part of the mustelid family, so, they're related to wolverines and other kind of feisty animals, and so they're very daring, they're often very courageous, and so I'm not surprised that this otter would be brave enough to want to hop on a surfboard, and so I think because of that, we humans, we kinda have to moderate our behavior and decide how we're gonna interact when sea otters take bold moves like this, and I think it's really important to know, like, because we can't control a sea otter hopping on a board or however they wanna interact with us, but we can control how we react to that, and so I think always trying to maximize space, um, and giving them room to kind of let their natural behavior be, I think is the best way to go.
Do they like to surf on waves just with their body?
Sea otters, that so when they forage a lot in breaking surf where they have those big waves. And what they tend to do is when they come up to the surface with a prey item, they'll usually just kind of go along with the wave and move with the wave in while they're eating. So the waves don't disturb them. I don't know if they're enjoying it while they're eating. But sometimes when they see a big wave coming, you can see an otter kind of decide what they're gonna do. Some otters, they'll kind of remain at the surface and go along with the wave. Others will see a big wave coming and they said, "Oh no," and then they'll just dive back into the water and then wait for the wave to pass to come back up and eat their food. So it's really interesting to see them make these decisions and even just how they interact with the wave. Yeah, some otters are they'll just go with the wave, the others will try to avoid it, so it's really interesting to see how all these behaviors differ.
Okay. Yeah, maybe that one author just found it interesting what the humans doing with the surfboard and the waves.
Yes. I think so.
And looking ahead, what do you hope your research will contribute to our understanding of sea otters, not just in Japan, but globally?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is that sea otters, they're in a stage of recovery, and we need to understand that we have a part to play here. Um, whether that means actively helping out with their conservation, um, through reintroduction in some parts of their range, or through even smaller actions like picking up litter, educating other people about sea otter vulnerabilities and what we can do to be better stewards. I think that's the biggest takeaway is that anyone can contribute to sea otter conservation in ways big and small. No matter where you are or how sea otters are doing in your area where you live, there's always more to do because
Yeah,
they're all in various stages of recovery.
nice. And if you could say one last things to the viewers about sea otters or conservation, what would that be?
Oh, that's a tough question. Um, I think I think the biggest thing that I've learned throughout my sea otter research is that sea otters are individuals. They each have their own personality, and it's important to recognize that. And I think that humanizes them. And in doing that, I think we're more inclined to want to conserve them. Really, they're just like really fluffy humans. Um, they each have they each have their own um yeah, wants, desires, interests, just like us. And so that's always important to keep in mind, and I think that's what will ultimately drive their conservation is us understanding that we're not very different from them. We all live in the same environment, and so we should lend a hand and help out with their recovery.
Thanks so much for giving an insight into the world of sea otters and your research. It was really interesting. I hope I will see you on the podcast in some years again, talking about your newest research and everything that you found in between. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun, and I hope the listeners enjoy listening to this too.
I think so.